House Affairs Committee.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for upholding one of the most important principles of parliamentary democracy, and that is that those who are tasked with the awesome responsibility of making laws, passing taxation measures, and spending money have all the information that they could possibly need to properly do their jobs. Here in this House, we vote on all different kinds of legislation. We vote on laws that touch on broadcasting, on agriculture, on food labeling laws. And to do that, we need to make sure that we fully understand all the issues, all the possible ramifications of our decisions. And so to do that, at various stages along the legislative process, we rely on information, usually in the form of either testimony by witnesses or by documents, by papers. The same is true when we talk about taxation. For those that remember our political science lessons either in high school or university, we know that there's one characteristic that separates government from every other institution in our society, every other entity. The one thing that truly makes government different from any other organization is its monopoly on the use of force. I can ignore what my local community association might want me to do. I might be involved in a volunteer group, and they might want members to conform to one thing or another. I have the choice as to whether or not I want to continue to be a part of that organization. But none of us have the choice when it comes to government, because at the end of the day, government backs up all its decisions with that monopoly on the use of force. Right. Citizens must comply. They must follow the law, or they will forcibly be punished for that refusal. The same is true when it comes to taxation. At the end of the day, all the taxation measures that are passed here are built upon the bedrock that the government will send someone to arrest you if you do not pay your fair share of taxes. So when the government collects those tax dollars out of the pockets of the hardworking Canadians who earned it, the people who get up before the sun rises and come home after it's set, when we reach into their pockets after they've earned their pay through the toil and sweat and often blood that they expend to do their job, we better have a darn good reason to take that money out of their pockets. And when the government takes all that money and collects it here in Ottawa and decides who to give it to, it better darn well be for the reasons it was explained to take the money in the first place. And what we uncovered with the SDTC Green Slush Fund scandal was abhorrent. It violated the fundamental basic premise of responsible government, the idea that the dollar that is taxed should go to the program that it was allocated for the reasons that it was. What we found out is that the government set up this fund and appointed the board of directors, basically out of the ranks of Liberal supporters. The Liberal-friendly board of directors started to make decisions as to the allocation of that money to fund their own companies, to fund projects, Mr. Speaker, that the Auditor General found didn't even have a single environmental benefit. So the government went out and collected money from the hard-earned dollars of workers across the country, said that we're going to take this money forcibly from you, but don't worry, we're going to spend it on all kinds of good things that will benefit the environment. But instead, they were funneling that cash to their friends and supporters and cronies. Yep. That is shameful. And it took a great deal of work. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the hard-working members of that committee, so my colleagues sitting right here, who came in after hours, meetings on break weeks and during recesses to pore through those accounts, to force testimony from those officials who made those decisions and some of the beneficiaries of that graft. And we exposed this slush fund for what it was, a way for the government to funnel tax dollars into the pockets of their partisan supporters. Do you remember when a certain someone said that sunlight was the best disinfectant? I'm old enough to remember that, Mr. Speaker. I remember that was the mantra that this Prime Minister got elected on. But like so many things about this Prime Minister, it was not quite as advertised, was it? Because it has taken tremendous effort from parliamentary committee and now a production order from the House itself for the government to hand over the simple documentation as to who got paid. That should be the simplest thing. I mean, that shouldn't even require a motion at committee. That should just be a normal matter of that departments should follow on their own accord. They should proactively be disclosing this type of thing. Or when a committee member asks for it, it should be provided. No questions asked. Only a government that had something to hide would go to such great lengths to keep it hidden. And think about this. This government has forced this House to use precious time out of our legislative calendar to force that information from them. They could have resolved this right from day one. When the first hints that something was wrong, they could have immediately said, you know what, we're going to come clean. If we've got nothing to hide, here you go. Here are all the documents. Save a bunch of committee time, a bunch of House time. We could have got these documents, and we and Canadians could have learned exactly what happened. But the very fact that to this day, they are still redacting pieces of paper, they're still refusing to hand over documents, is so telling, and certainly not the actions of someone who has nothing to hide. I'd like to quote for the House some interesting statements on that principle of disclosure. This is from a gentleman whose name is Mr. McKinnon, who I believe is related to the current Minister of Labour, Paul McKinnon. He sent an advisement up the chain of command that said, quote, this is from September 15th, 2021, in preparation for this Parliament. He said, quote, in the event that parliamentarians press for the release of confidential information, the appropriate minister or ministers should take responsibility for the decision to provide or withhold the information. That has not happened. He went on to say in a later date, consistent with the principles of responsible government, the ultimate accountability for deciding what information to withhold from or release to parliamentarians resides with the responsible minister. Public servants do not share in ministers' constitutional accountability to the Houses of Parliament. It's the ministers themselves, Mr. Speaker, that have this requirement. So these ministers responsible for these departments who refuse to hand over those documents are, in effect, in contempt of Parliament. And that's why our original motion called for that fact to be recognized, gave the government a very reasonable one-week deadline to provide the documents that they already have. They already have in their possession these documents. It's not a case that they have to go scouring through emails. I should mention at this point, Mr. Speaker, I will be sharing my time with the Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable as well. Please give me a little bit of notice when I get to my 10-minute time. I see you're giving me a signal for 2 minutes. I just want to reinforce that point, Mr. Speaker. These documents exist. We know they exist because they were the subject of the Auditor General's audit. So all we're asking for is simply to take those documents, provide them to the law clerk. The law clerk can then provide them to the RCMP. If, as we suspect, crimes were committed, we owe it to the Canadian taxpayers who were robbed of their hard-earned money because the money did not go to what the government said it was going to go to. It went to liberal-friendly firms. I mean, think about it. A board of director making a decision to allocate money to a company that they had a financial interest in, that they themselves owned. They were using taxpayers' money to funnel it right into the companies that they owned and profited from. That is an egregious abuse of taxpayers' money. That's why this production order was so important. That's why it is such a contempt of this House that the government ignored that. And that's why all members of Parliament, if they pretend to believe in any sense of parliamentary accountability, should support this motion. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting comments, to say the very least. Nothing that really surprises me. But the question that I have for the member is, he made reference to the consumption of the House time. And I'd like to take him up on that thought, because if he's really concerned about the time inside the House, would he not agree that it might be best then to deal with this issue in the next 30 minutes? He's got a motion that's there. Would he be comfortable in allowing it to ultimately go to committee shortly after or shortly before 6:30 and provide that assurance that he'd be comfortable in doing so?
House Leader for the Official Opposition.
I have an even better idea that will save even more time. Produce the documents.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank our House Leader for, outlining exactly this incident, but this is a pattern of behavior, Mr. Speaker. The Winnipeg documents were not produced, and there were extremes gone to suppress those. The We Charity scandal documents were the same. We see time and again this Liberal government obstructing transparency, and if they had nothing to hide, as he well pointed out, that would be fine. But clearly they do have something to hide, and the more we find out, the more criminal it sounds. Could the member comment on that pattern of behavior?
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
That is a great point, because it's almost like some of us have seen this movie before. This isn't the first production order that the House has had to adopt in order to get information. The Winnipeg Labs document is an excellent example where all kinds of concerns were raised about national security and what information the Government of Canada was allowing to be passed to the communist regime in Beijing about a pandemic that had and the lockdowns that had such a devastating effect on the Canadian people and on the economy. And the government not only refused to release those documents, but actually took your predecessor to court, sued the Speaker of the House of Commons to try to prevent those documents, that information from coming to light. So again, this government is now a serial abuser of parliamentary privilege and a serial committer of the crime of suppressing important information that Canadians have a right to know.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Regina Louvain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my colleague from Regina Capella's intervention. I do wonder, though, we've seen just the tip of the iceberg of who has all got money, which Liberal insiders are getting rich. We've seen it, the Foreign Affairs Minister's husband's got some contracts in other areas. Does he believe, how deep does he think this rot is, and how long will it take to have this go through committee and actually find out how much taxpayers' dollars has gone to Liberal insider friends and family?
The Honourable House Leader.
That's a great question, and I think the honourable member knows that at the end of the day, Liberals get a Liberal. This is a part of their DNA. If you look back at every Liberal administration, there are examples where they use the power of their positions to reward and enrich their friends. So again, this is something that I believe many Canadians were fooled by the Prime Minister back in 2015 when he tried to cast himself as something different. But it didn't take long for people to see that he was the same old kind of Liberal. They seek power, not to do what's best for Canadians, but to implement their own wacko, extreme ideological agenda, but most importantly, to enrich their friends who helped them get there in the first place.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a vitally important issue, which I've had the unfortunate pleasure of working on for now more than a year and a half. And I'd like to ask the Official Opposition House Leader, the Privy Council office is the office of the Prime Minister, the personal department.
Order, and I quite realized it afterwards that the Honourable Member is not in his chair. So there you go. You're going to be sitting in your chair. The Honourable Member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From the top. So the Privy Council office, which ordered redactions, the government departments to redact the documents being sought by the House of Commons about the Green Slush Fund, is the personal department of the Prime Minister. So I'd like the Official Opposition House Leader, if he could, to comment on why he thinks the Privy Council office would make that order, and would they have been directed by someone else?
Honourable Leader du groupe de l'Opposition.
Well, that's a great question, and my honourable colleague is very familiar with the inner workings of government, having a long and celebrated career in public service in previous administrations. So he knows exactly how this works. And there is no way that a production order that touched on all these departments would not rise to the level of being on the Prime Minister's desk. There is only one person responsible for refusing this production order from the House, and that's the Prime Minister himself.